Bom dia a todas e todos. É com muito prazer e felicidade que eu dou início e abro o nosso ano acadêmico, dou início aqui à nossa Semana de Abertura do programa de Mestrado e Doutorado Acadêmico em Direito e Desenvolvimento da FGV Direito São Paulo. Enfim, estou muito feliz em começar o ano acadêmico ao lado de colegas tão queridos e os quais eu admiro muito. Acho que eu só estaria mais feliz se esse encontro fosse presencial, mas eu espero que essa seja a nossa última atividade exclusivamente online, né? A gente está preparado, como todos sabem, para retomar a nossa vida presencial na semana que vem. Eu queria, enfim, agradecer, sei que nesses 2 anos, sei que foi um período muito difícil para todos nós, né? A gente passou por poucas e boas na pandemia e não paramos de continuar produzindo, discutindo, organizamos ainda mais eventos, né? Mais webinários, mais discussões internacionais. Acho que a gente foi... nossa comunidade conseguiu sobreviver a tudo isso de maneira muito produtiva, e sei que isso também teve um custo pessoal muitas vezes enorme, né? Reconheço que isso foi muito difícil, agradeço a resiliência de todas e todos, espero que a gente agora comece um ano um pouco mais leve. Quer dizer, é quase uma ironia dizer isso, né? Porque essa semana começa também num momento muito difícil, em que a gente ainda está sofrendo os efeitos da pandemia e vivendo uma guerra, né? Mas eu acho que começar o ano desse jeito, né? Numa situação difícil como essa, mas começar também começar com esta semana é o nosso começo e a nossa declaração de aposta profunda na ciência e no diálogo, né? E tudo que a gente tudo que essa semana significa é justamente isso, né? Nós aqui no mundo da academia estamos profundamente conectados com os problemas que estamos vivendo, com os problemas dos problemas globais e locais que o mundo, né, que o país atravessa. As nossas mesas são todas de temas absolutamente contemporâneos e fundamentais para pensar o futuro do país e do direito. E eu acho que, enfim, eu gostaria, aliás, de agradecer a todos os professores, todos os pesquisadores, todos os alunos e todas as alunas que participam dessa semana. Eu fico muito... Acho que ela dá um pouco... Ela ilustra como nossa comunidade é vibrante e tem realmente essa paixão por fazer pesquisa e discutir pesquisa e produzir conhecimento e avançar na busca desse conhecimento. Então, durante a semana, a gente tem, não por acaso, 3 mesas sobre a pandemia, né, e os efeitos da pandemia. A gente vai discutir racismo, a gente vai discutir reescritas feministas, a gente tem mesa sobre violência policial, os núcleos de pesquisa, cada núcleo de pesquisa tem uma sessão especial apresentando as suas pesquisas. A gente tem uma mesa que me deu muita felicidade em organizar, que é uma mesa de autores e autoras que são alunos do nosso programa e já publicaram livros. Enfim, eu acho que o que a gente faz aqui nessa semana é um pouco começar também o semestre com o que a gente mais gosta de fazer, que é apresentar nossas pesquisas, discutir nossas pesquisas e avançar na produção do conhecimento. Tem uma música que eu acho que é quase uma profissão de fé, vou citá-la aqui, uma música do Tom Zé, que diz o que salva a humanidade é que não há quem cure a curiosidade. Eu acho que essa é uma representação muito interessante da nossa profissão, né, de pesquisadores, pesquisadoras e professores que estão atrás, né, são movidos por uma curiosidade incansável de tentar entender o mundo, de tentar produzir melhores respostas para os nossos problemas, né, de avançar, fazer avançar o conhecimento e a ciência. Então, acho que é também uma maneira de fazer o que a gente mais gosta, mas também homenagear os cientistas e as cientistas que recentemente sofreram ataques, passaram por momentos difíceis. A gente vive momentos difíceis no país, de corte a financiamentos de pesquisa. Então, acho que o momento nosso aqui de aprendizado, mas também de celebração da ciência, do conhecimento e, enfim, homenageando um pouco esse campo, né, que tem, paradoxalmente, sofrido ataques e se mostrado tão fundamental para o futuro da humanidade. Eu passo, então, enfim, gostaria só, como último agradecimento, além de agradecer todos e todas que vão fazer parte dessa semana e que são a beleza, né, da nossa pluralidade e da nossa diversidade aqui no programa, gostaria de agradecer especialmente ao Pedro Moalen, que não pôde estar presente com a gente hoje na abertura, porque teve um problema de saúde, mas foi a pessoa que praticamente concentrou toda a organização, e sem ele, essa semana não teria saído. O Pedro ele é pesquisador da coordenação também do Núcleo de Direito e Economia Política, vai falar no último dia. Gostaria também de agradecer a equipe da coordenação, né? Todos contribuíram muito à organização também, Camila Alves, Larissa Margarido, Luiz Pimenta, Mariana Puschel, e a equipe da FGV, em nome, nas pessoas da Cristine Prestes e da Sheila Jimenez. Com muita felicidade também, passo a palavra para o meu querido colega, Otávio Ferraz, que é professor de Direito do King's College e co-diretor do Transnational Law Institute, e ele é também, a gente tem a honra de tê-lo como um Global Fellow, Senior Global Fellow da nossa escola. Isso quer dizer que temos uma relação muito próxima e produtiva, e para a nossa felicidade, o Otávio está passando esse semestre aqui na escola, então, enfim, e além de tudo, é o organizador de toda a programação que se segue a esta abertura, né? Então, queria, enfim, te agradecer, Otávio, pela organização das mesas de hoje, enfim, te dar boas-vindas à nossa comunidade, espero que a sua estadia aqui seja muito produtiva e, enfim, seguimos nessa conversa. Passo a palavra para você e muito obrigado, enfim, muito obrigado pela presença aqui nessa abertura. Acho que é muito significativo abrirmos a semana com a sua presença aqui, anunciando a nossa colaboração e a sua estada aqui, o privilégio de ter você conosco nesse semestre.
Eu que agradeço, Marta. Tem um disclaimer que pediram para você fazer. Você quer fazer?
Já ensaiamos 1000 vezes e eu estava esquecendo do disclaimer. Vamos lá, vou fazer um disclaimer aqui, oficial, de tudo que é transmitido na GV, e tomo a liberdade de ler. As manifestações expressas por integrantes dos quadros da Fundação Getúlio Vargas e por convidados que participam dos eventos e transmissões online representam exclusivamente as opiniões dos seus autores e não necessariamente a posição institucional da FGV. Reiteramos também que todos aqui presentes concordaram em participar desse evento de forma espontânea e, com isso, autorizam o uso de sua imagem para essa transmissão, que ficará disponível posteriormente nos canais oficiais da FGV. O outro recado institucional que eu preciso dar é que todas as mesas transmitidas pelo YouTube permitem que os participantes façam perguntas pelo Slido, que é um link que fica ali embaixo da descrição do vídeo no YouTube. Então, com isso, eu passo a palavra para o Otávio, que é o grande organizador, e ia falar... Bom, me fugiu a palavra. Não é só organizador, era enfim, quem pensou, né, quem estruturou, e idealizador era a palavra que deveria vir, idealizador do dia de discussões de hoje. Otávio, passo para você.
Muito obrigada, Marta. É um enorme prazer e honra estar aqui, né, nessa abertura do ano letivo do Direito GV, da pós-graduação, mestrado e doutorado. Eu agradeço a você, ao Pedro, ao Oscar, todos os outros colegas, a Luciana, que já está aqui, a quem vai palestrar. Não vou dizer o nome de todo mundo, é muita gente, né? A Semana de Abertura está realmente incrível. É uma pena estar em São Paulo, né, como eu estou, mas novamente participando pelo computador, mas em tempos pandêmicos, acho que é o mínimo que nós podemos fazer, né? Quem sabe no próximo evento nós nos vejamos em pessoa, ou em carne e osso, como se costumava dizer. Eu estou particularmente feliz com essa semana, porque ela marca para mim o início da minha colaboração mais estreita, ou oficial, por assim dizer, com a FGV, como o tal do Senior Global Fellow, né? Eu aceitei esse honroso convite em 2019, mas infelizmente veio a pandemia. Meus planos de vir ao Brasil tiveram que ser adiados por quase 3 anos, né? Mas, enfim, aqui eu estou muito feliz, e também porque essa semana marca o início oficial também, vamos dizer assim, dessa parceria entre o Transnational Law Institute, que eu dirijo lá no King's College de Londres, e a FGV, em especial com a professora Marta Machado, que eu admiro muito, então vai ser um enorme prazer poder colaborar. A gente já conversou um pouco sobre 2 áreas de interesse comum entre a FGV e o TLI, como a gente chama o Transnational Law Institute, que são direitos humanos e atuação policial, na qual as 2 entidades já têm projetos de pesquisa bastante avançados, e a outra que é o direito ambiental, onde também há projetos, talvez em fase menos avançada. Então, essas são as 2 áreas que a gente está tentando ver se a gente consegue fazer essa colaboração mais estreita, e a gente vai aproveitar a minha estadia aqui no Brasil para tentar detalhar e aprofundar mais essa nossa parceria, idealmente com projetos de pesquisa colaborativos nessas 2 áreas, mas também, se possível, com intercâmbio entre professores e alunos da FGV e do King's College. Então, vocês, alunos do mestrado e do doutorado, fiquem atentos para mais informações sobre esses futuros projetos, no qual haverá certamente oportunidade da participação de vocês. E, além de noticiar e marcar o início dessa parceria, eu gostaria de falar um pouquinho, nesses 5 minutos que faltam antes da primeira mesa, sobre o Transnational Law Institute, o TLI, né? Eu agradeço imensamente, Marta, esse espaço nobre que vocês me concederam aqui para falar do nosso instituto lá, né? Eu vou falar não só sobre o instituto em geral, mas também de um projeto em andamento, que talvez seja o principal projeto atual, o Lex Atlas COVID-19, no qual nós teremos 2 mesas ainda hoje, uma às 10 e a outra depois do almoço às 2 da tarde, com participação de colegas do Reino Unido, da Argentina, da Colômbia e do México. Então, primeiro, uma breve nota sobre o TLI, né? O TLI é um centro de pesquisa em direito transnacional fundado em 2014, com uma doação generosa, talvez não, acho que é a maior já recebida por uma escola de direito do Reino Unido, de um empresário de Hong Kong radicado em Londres, chamado Dixon Poon. E essa doação permitiu a contratação de vários professores a partir de 2014, entre eles eu, mas também o professor Per Zumbansen, do Canadá, alemão originalmente, e a professora Eva Pils, que é uma especialista em China. E nesses 8 anos, né, desde 2014, o TLI se consolidou não só como um dos principais centros de pesquisa em Transnational Law, direito transnacional, mas também de ensino. Então, nós temos um projeto, um programa de mestrado focado exclusivamente em Transnational Law, que talvez seja um dos poucos do mundo e que recebe todo ano alunos do mundo inteiro, inclusive do Brasil. E esse mestrado cobre diversas áreas, incluindo direitos humanos, direito criminal, direito ambiental, governança corporativa, direito tributário, sociologia do direito e várias outras. Eu acho que essa combinação de um mestrado específico e de um centro de pesquisas, ela é muito frutífera, tanto para os alunos como os professores, porque facilita oportunidades de contato e de pesquisa e cria uma verdadeira comunidade de direito transnacional dentro da escola de direito lá do King's College. Os alunos de mestrado, por exemplo, além de comparecer em eventos do TLI, né, palestras, seminários que ocorrem durante o ano, eles também participam como assistentes em projetos de pesquisa e também na nossa clínica, né, a Transnational Law Clinic, que a gente faz todos os anos. Então, é isso que eu gostaria que nossa colaboração também pudesse, eventualmente, permitir, né? Esse intercâmbio entre os alunos daqui e de lá. Vamos ver se a gente consegue fazer. Só para dar um exemplo, na clínica, a última intervenção que a gente fez foi um amicus curiae para o caso de descriminalização do aborto na Corte Constitucional da Colômbia, que, como vocês sabem, acabou saindo vencedor por uma breve margem, né, de 5-4 no ano passado. E é claro que todos nós, lá no Transnational Law Institute, ficamos muito felizes de ter dado essa pequena contribuição para essa vitória, lá nesse caso histórico, da Colômbia. Um dos principais, em relação aos projetos de pesquisa, que são, na verdade, né, o carro-chefe do Transnational Law Institute, nós temos vários projetos em 3 áreas principais. Uma é direitos humanos, democracia e Estado de Direito, a outra é direito ambiental e a outra é direito à saúde, ou Health Law. E nessa que se insere esse projeto do Lex Atlas Covid-19, que eu vou introduzir com um pouco mais de tempo na mesa seguinte, e que nós teremos 2 mesas hoje sobre esse assunto. A que já vai começar daqui a pouco, sobre declarações de emergência e escrutínio legislativo, e uma tarde sobre comparações na América Latina, com a participação de colegas da Argentina, da Colômbia e do México, e eu vou falar sobre o Brasil também. Então, para quem quiser saber um pouco mais sobre o projeto, por favor, participe dessas mesas. E também gostaria de lembrar que vai ter uma mesa na quinta-feira, organizada pelo nosso colega Daniel Wang, sobre a judicialização na pandemia. Então, para terminar, que eu estou vendo que já está quase no horário de começar a nossa mesa, eu gostaria de voltar à parceria com a FGV, agradecer de novo o acolhimento caloroso da Marta, do Oscar, do Pedro, da Luciana, de todos os colegas, dizer que eu estou muito feliz de estar finalmente aqui por um período mais longo e espero que nós poderemos nos encontrar pessoalmente em breve, em carne e osso, no próximo evento. Um abraço a todos e obrigado pela atenção.
Muito obrigada, Otávio. Que bom que a empolgação é mútua. E eu passo... a gente achou que não ia ter assunto, né, para essa meia hora, a gente já estourou. Eu passo aqui a palavra para a Luciana. Agradeço a Luciana enfim, que está atuando, na verdade, em várias mesas, né? Agradeço a Luciana porque eu estou aqui com ela agora, mas ela organizou, pela organização e pela participação em várias mesas da semana, inclusive, enfim, a Luciana tem um papel muito importante de estimular os alunos, organizou mesa com os alunos, fiquei muito feliz com isso também, de que é uma semana em que os nossos alunos e as nossas alunas também apresentam trabalhos e participam, não estão apenas na plateia, e acho que isso, boa parte desse esforço de trazer os alunos e de dar protagonismo aos alunos também vem da atuação da Luciana. Então, eu agradeço a Luciana por esta semana e por essa participação, e passo a palavra para ela, que vai nos coordenar todos os participantes. Dou boas-vindas a todos os participantes da próxima mesa, e que a Luciana vai agora coordenar e apresentar devidamente. Luciana, com você.
Muito obrigada, Marta. First of all, I would like to start by thanking Marta and Otávio and Pedro for the invitation to moderate this first panel of the opening week of the Academic Master and PhD program at FGV Law School, Emergency Declarations and Parliamentary Scrutiny in the Pandemic Comparative Notes. Before we start, I have to say some words from FGV. All statements expressed by Fundação Getúlio Vargas, employees and guests in our online events and broadcasts exclusively represent their opinions and not necessarily FGV institutional position. We also reiterate that everyone present here agreed to participate in this event of their own free will, and they consented to be recorded in this broadcast, which will be posted later on FGV official channels. It's a pleasure to be here, even if online, seeing old friends like Otávio and Siri. Welcome for this first panel. And moderating this panel where participants will present and discuss some of the results produced from the Lex Atlas COVID-19 project. The LAC 19 around the world, with the participation of nearly 200 jurists who have contributed to writing national country reports. Besides creating an impressive database for academic use, the LAC 19 contributes to the establishment of new standards of accountability and responsiveness to public policies. I will start to introduce the speakers and let the audience that follow us through YouTube channel of FGV Law School, that we will be able to make questions through the Slido platform. I think that we are waiting for Professor Jeff King. Otávio, do you have any news? Oops, you are on mute.
I've just texted him to see. He has young kids, so I suspect he's probably going to join us in a few minutes.
Okay, so I will start to introduce you and Professor Andrew and also Siri, and when he will be with us, I introduce him also. We are here with Otávio Ferraz, the co-director of the Transnational Law Institute from King's College, London, and FGV Direito São Paulo Senior Global Fellow. Professor Andrew Jones, Research Fellow at University College London, Faculty of Law, and Professor Siri Glopin, Professor and Director of the Center on Law and Social Transformation of the University of Bergen, who will comment on the presentation made by Otávio, Jeff, and Andrew. Otávio, do you want to start?
Okay, I will start, and hopefully Jeff will join us in time. If he doesn't, then Andrew could perhaps start his presentation and put the order that way. So thank you again for being for inviting us to be able to present our project here at Fundação Getúlio Vargas, where I'm also honored to be a senior global fellow since 2019, which is a position that gives me a lot of honor and happiness. The pandemic delayed by 2 years my plans to collaborate more closely with GV, but I'm finally here. So I am delighted to be able to finally start more closely this cooperation, as I have already said in the opening. So forgive me if you were already there, but I think it bears re-emphasizing. And the other thing that the pandemic gave us, if not only negative things, was this opportunity to do research on this really important topic, which is this interaction between law and emergencies of all sorts. In this case, a public health one, but I'm sure that I don't need to remind anyone here in this call today that emergencies are unfortunately abounding in our world today across the globe, not least the climate one, but we have another war happening as we speak as well. So the table today will be pandemic, emergency declarations, and legislative scrutiny. But before we move on to Andrew and Jeff to talk about this really interesting, as I hope you will agree, findings of this project, and then hear my great friend and colleague Siri comment on it. I'm really glad you're here with us as well, Siri. Thank you so much. I wanted to give you a bit of context of the Lex Atlas COVID-19, or LEC-19 simply, as we started to call it, because it's so long, even too long to say LAC-19, Luciana. So we decided to say LEC-19, and that's what we say now. So I wanted to give you a bit of context so you understand how this incredible data that you are going to see in a few moments has emerged. And I will start with a very personal note about when the project was born, because we were at the very beginning of the pandemic, not living home, like I live in East London, where Jeff, Professor Jeff King, who I will only refer as Jeff from now on because he's a very good friend, also lives. And he came round to my place and said, I have an idea. I want to know what you think. And the idea, which had great insight and foresight, I must say, was that he noted that none of the people who were discussing the different measures adopted by countries to fight the pandemic, like journalists, government officials, policymakers, etc., had comprehensive and accurate information about what these measures really were. The information was very superficial and fragmented at that time, and that bothered Jeff, and it started bothering me as well when he talked to me about his idea. So to give you an example, the most heated debate in those early days of the pandemic was whether the UK should adopt some form of lockdown, a strict lockdown, like Italy and Spain, who had the first deaths, like in Europe, were adopting, or whether we should take what was then called the Swedish approach, which was allegedly much softer than Italy and Spain. But how could we know what really the Italian, Spanish, or Swedish, or any other country's approach was? All we had at that time was these fragmented pieces of news, interviews with public health officials, and other almost anecdotal accounts here and there about what was happening in other countries. We heard also, Siri, that, in Scandinavia, Norway and Denmark are taking a different approach from Sweden, for instance. But how could we know what was really happening in those places? And as a Brazilian, for instance, I knew that the reports I read about Brazil were not very accurate. So we really needed something, a resource that was much deeper and accurate in detail than about countries' responses to COVID than we had at that time. And more than that, the resource should also enable interested people to understand why a certain country adopted a particular response, and not simply what response it adopted. So to use Sweden as an example again, did it really never have a lockdown? And if so, why? Well, what could explain that Sweden, which is so close to Norway and Denmark, had such a different approach? So we wanted to know that. To give Brazil as an example, it was a puzzle for people in the UK, perhaps in other countries as well. How can Brazil have so many pandemic regulations if what is reported in the news is that the president is a denialist opposed to any public health measures? So what's going on? Like, do they have pandemic regulations, lockdowns, or don't they? Finally, to use another example, which was quite and still is prominent, New Zealand. How did it have so many few deaths compared to other countries, which took identical measures to New Zealand? So did New Zealand really take the same measures? Did they do something different? And so on and so forth. So the great insight I think Jeff had was that while the public opinion of public health experts who became celebrities overnight with the pandemic was obviously, and still is, very important, perhaps the most important during a pandemic. It was only lawyers, and in particular public law and health law experts, who could navigate and explain the myriad of complex regulations coming out daily and in breakneck speed and enormous quantities from across the world. So we needed to assemble teams of experts from around the world to write reports on the regulations adopted in their own countries. And these reports, and this is all about Jeff's idea at the very beginning of the pandemic I'm still talking about, right? These reports would form a collection which anyone interested in a single country's response or in comparing different countries could easily consult to know exactly in an accurate and deep manner what happened in each of those countries. Now, when Jeff asked me if I thought it was a good idea, I said, yes, definitely. It's not only good, it's a brilliant idea. When he asked me if I thought it was doable or if I thought it was mad, I said, well, it is a bit mad given the scale of the enterprise, gigantic in proportions. But I also said that if there was anyone capable of delivering that mad idea, it was Jeff. Knowing his incredible work capacity, I said, go for it. I think you can do it. But then came the third question. Are you going to do it with me? I'm not going to do it if you don't join. And then at that time, it was already impossible for me to say no. I said it was a brilliant idea, it's doable. And so why don't you do it with me? I accepted, and although sometimes I question my wisdom in accepting the challenge because the scale is really gigantic, I am really great that I did accept it in the end because the results are starting to come out now. And I think it was really necessary and well worth doing, as I hope you will agree with me when you see what Andrew and Jeff, I don't know if he's joined already, start showing the data. Now, I could say much, much more about how that embryonic idea that Jeff had in the beginning of 2020 turned into what we can call now, with some pride, the LAC-19 project. It exists, it is there, but I'm conscious of time. So I will just briefly mention a few important highlights to give you a bit more context, and also to Siri, who is the first opportunity, if I'm not mistaken, Siri, for us to talk in more depth and at more length about this. So after Jeff left, we said, okay, we are going to do it. So we worked on a research proposal. Before we presented it to the world, so to speak, we presented to 3 institutions, King's College, my own, University College, Jeff's institution, and the Max Planck Institute in Heidelberg to see what they thought. They all liked the idea, and more than that, generously committed to provide the initial funding for us to get the project off the ground. So King's, UCL, and Max Planck each contributed 1/3 of what was, I think, about £100,000 at that time for us to start doing the project. And then when we had that institutional support and a bit more detail in what the project would do, we decided to apply for a larger grant to the UK main funding body, the UKRI, which is a kind of CAPES, I think, here in Brazil. And we were lucky to get, I think, 7 or 8 times more than we had initially to complete and enhance the project. In particular, hiring people like Andrew, who is a political scientist, to help us organize and analyze the incredible amount of data that we are going to get with 60 reports from across the world. Another important thing I think to highlight is that once we had all that in place, we managed to have an agreement with Oxford University Press to publish all the reports open access, so anyone across the world can go in there and use our data. in what is now called the Oxford Compendium of National Legal Responses to COVID-19. So if you Google that, you'll have a link to the Oxford Constitutional Law website, where you can read any of the eventually 60 reports. At the moment, I think we have about half of those already there. We also have a website, the lexatlas-c19.org, where we publish much more than the reports. We publish commentary, we have a blog session, we have symposiums on separate issues, like mandatory vaccination was one that we had recently. And we will have the data sets and the data analysis that Andrew is leading, and we'll soon have many more outputs beyond the emergency declarations and legislative scrutiny, which are the first ones that we are going to present today. So we will hear from Jeff and Andrew on only two of the many other issues that Lex Atlas 19 allows us to analyze. And we are obviously not enough people in the LEC 19 community to explore that data to its full potential and capacity. So we really want to encourage you, anyone from across the globe who are interested, either in a particular country, I repeat, or in comparative analysis, to go there and use our data. It will be all open there and open access for you to help us to produce more analysis than the ones that we are capable of producing. So I'm almost finishing, but I said earlier that we wanted to provide an accurate account of what the measures were and why the response was in a certain manner in particular countries. So we could call this the what and why questions, but there is also another kind of question that we think the LEC 19 can help us answer, which is the how question, which is extremely important as well. And I think our compendium might help us to investigate. So there is a lot of variation in what countries did in response to the pandemic. There is no doubt about that, both at the more general level. For instance, some adopted rather restrictive lockdowns, others never did or didn't do it in the same strict manner. I mentioned Sweden already. Some closed their borders, others didn't. Some imposed the use of masks, others didn't, and so on and so forth. But there is also interesting variation in how the same measures were implemented in different countries. And this is important to understand outcomes and responsiveness, as Luciana was mentioning in her opening, to the pandemic. This covers specific and sometimes even bizarre policy details, such, for instance, in Buenos Aires, which we'll hear more about in the room, there was a rota, rodízio in Portuguese, based on the number of people's identity cards, IDs. So people with IDs ending with odd numbers could leave their homes only on odd days, whereas people with IDs ending in even numbers could only leave their homes in even days. And I wonder how they negotiated the fact that some months of the year have more uneven days, the 31st, than even days, whether there's some demonstrations that was discriminatory to people with even IDs. In Peru, there was a really interesting gender lockdown, the so-called pico y género policy. Men were allowed to go out on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and women on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. You might be asking, so what happened on Sundays? Was everyone able to go out and do super spreader events? No, on Sundays, no one was allowed in the streets. So 3 days men, 3 days for women, Sunday, complete lockdown. Colombia, which is also going to be in the afternoon session, tried to combine the gender and the ID thing and had both pico y género and pico y cédula, from cédula de identidade card. I don't know how they managed to do such a complex combination, but no wonder that magic realism thrived so well in Latin America in comparison to other countries around the globe. So if you want to know more about Latin America, come to the 2 o'clock table in the afternoon. But this how question can also be explored, and this is my final comment before I pass on to our speakers, on issues more closely related to law. For instance, how and in what manner was law used to impose pandemic measures? So there's so many, only a few. What types of legal instruments were used in different countries? Emergency declarations, for instance, can be constitutional, can be legislative, can be by executive decree, and this has a very important influence in how much democratic scrutiny or lack thereof took place in pandemic measures, in how basic rule of law principles were respected or not respected, as the case may be. We also have questions about what the impact on fundamental rights were during the pandemic, and also vice versa. How did fundamental rights, strong legislation, impacted on what measures countries were capable of adopting? So to use Sweden a last time, we learned through COVID-19, to the LAC-19, that the reason why Sweden didn't have as strict a lockdown in the beginning of the pandemic as other countries was because the constitution didn't allow them to do that. And when the pandemic numbers started to become more worrying, they tried to amend the legal system to enable them to adopt those kinds of measures. So these are the kinds of questions which we think, and hope you will agree, only a project of the kind of the LAC-19 can help us to answer. And that's not to say that there are not brilliant other projects out there, which are also great, and we collaborate with some of them. There is the Blavatnik Oxford project, for instance, on the stringency of lockdown measures, which is really interesting. So we are just saying that kind of comprehensiveness and granularity in terms of legal responses, I think it's only through a mad project like that, I agree, it's mad, that can be achieved. And there are many other issues that we can and could discuss, but there won't be time, even with a full day, like the impact on freedom of expression, the impact on gender and racial equality, the impact on elections, whether mandatory vaccination schemes are violations of basic liberties of individuals, federalism, and many more. So I conclude now by thanking again FGV in the person of Marta, Luciana, Oscar, Pedro, to allow me to present our here today. And you will make use of this project. I emphasize open access for everyone to look at with no costs, no charges, in helping us deepen the analysis which LAC-19 enable us to carry out. So thank you again for your attention so far, and back to Luciana.
Thank you very much, Otávio. Professor Andrew?
Yes, I'll go first, I think. I've just received a message from Jeff, and he'll be on in about 5 minutes, so I'll start speaking, and then he can speak after me. And I'll add a little bit onto the start, but hopefully I won't send me too over time, just to kind of perhaps discuss some of the things that Jeff would have discussed had he spoke first. So let's see if I can do the challenge of sharing my screen, which quickly becomes the most challenging part of any presentation, it seems, at the moment. So can everybody see that? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, it's okay.
Good. Okay, so thanks for the introduction, and also thanks for the opportunity to speak at today's event. And I think Octavio's done a great job of kind of explaining the spiritual origins of the project and what it does. And perhaps I'll just kind of fill that in a little bit with some more practical stuff. So as Octavio said, the project tracks legal and institutional responses to COVID-19 in around 70 countries, or at least I think we're going to get somewhere near 70 countries at the end. As I say, it's this mammoth task, and we're moving steadily, and sometimes it's best to bite off little bits rather than see the project for what it is at the end, because it begins to get a little bit daunting. And it's a series of reports written by country authors, and often they are co-authored pieces because, again, they're so large, they average around 20,000. And again, I hesitate there to say 20,000 because they're expanding as the pandemic kind of expands from this idea that it was going to be all done and dusted in 6 months to it still dragging on kind of 2 years later. And the reports are written in accordance to an author guidance code. And this is a document detailing really some very specific questions that are answered by the country authors on the sorts of topics that Octavio was discussing. And then once written, this first draft goes through this really very robust editing process. And to give you an idea of exactly how kind of robust it is, we're often sending 100, 150 comments back to the authors, and remarkably, they all get commented on and back, and it's producing these great reports. But it also means that they're extremely comprehensive. We can guarantee that specific questions are answered in this, and that allows for this cross-country comparison of the reports. And really, if a project had stopped there, it would be this fantastic resource. But luckily, and not least for me and my future career prospects, Jeff and Octavia had this idea to kind of expand the impact of a project. And this was this idea of kind of LAC19 data, there we go, LAC19 data, which kind of recognised that these reports, although fantastic, struggle to make these easy comparisons, and also potentially the length and legalistic format of them might put off some kind of users who were unfamiliar with that sort of format. So I was brought onto a project, as Octavio says, I'm a political scientist by training, to produce some manageable data sets. And primarily these data sets take a quantitative format, and I'll be kind of presenting some of that quantitative data today, and so will Jeff after me. But they also contain this kind of really rich contextual and descriptive information. I'll also try to recognise that by pulling out some examples today. And most valuably, well, certainly I think it's most valuably, there's links to the relevant sections in the data sets which pinpoint you with one click of a mouse to the different areas of the report. And yeah, that allows this go between quantitative research into qualitative research, which then in turn can inform the quantitative research, and you get into this lovely cycle of kind of inductive versus deductive. And the data sets are a product of data mining techniques, and that's to say, that's a very fancy way of saying that me and Roxanne, who's the research assistant on the project, and the title of research assistant really doesn't give her credit for the work she's done producing these data sets. Yeah, me and Roxanne go through the reports and extract the relevant piece of information, and that's for the extent of the data mining. We spoke about automating the process. We realised that wasn't going to be very kind of effective. We also spoke about bringing a team of coders onto the team to do the work, but to increase the validity, me and Roxanne perhaps know the reports better than anyone, and we can pinpoint it most efficiently, and to make sure that information's out. So we produced a data set on emergency powers that Jeff will be talking about after me. I'll talk about parliaments today. We've also got one in the pipeline, immediate pipeline, which maybe will be 1 or 2 weeks on federalism, and plenty more of kind of, there's so much to go at that it's going to be a challenge of producing the data sets, not finding information. So yeah, today I'm going to be talking about kind of parliaments and the parliament's data set. And I'll be looking at 3 different areas of the parliament's data. The first is whether parliament's closed or not, and then giving a bit closer examination of the length of the time that parliaments were closed. And within this, I'll show how the LAC19 data is used really effectively to pinpoint a particular problematic case and go into much more detail. I'll then move away from this kind of open-closed binary and examine the reduction of operations in parliaments, namely the reduction of debates and committee processes, and I'll look at that through the lens of kind of system and government type. And finally, I'll examine the use of committees for scrutiny of COVID-19 measures. And yeah, in particular, the use of existing and specific committees for that. So let's move on straight away, because we're possibly struggling for a little bit of time after that introduction of this idea of open and close. So what I will say before I kind of move on here is we work on an assumption that there's a better outcome was delivered when parliaments remained open. And that's a bit of a problematic assumption, I'll admit that. I mean, not least because should parliaments be open in the middle of a pandemic where generally members are coming in from all around the country and then going back to their constituencies? But we kind of drew the conclusion that oversight could continue and also citizens could be represented during this time of, as Octavia's just touched on, really pretty invasive kind of policy responses. So here's a table which does the job of both kind of covering the parliaments that we have in the parliaments, the countries we have in the parliaments data set at the moment, but also showing whether parliaments were closed or not. So we can see that from the 39 countries in the data set, 23 or about 60% of those countries saw their parliaments remain open. And, you know, while this is descriptive information and maybe interesting, I think the most interesting analysis comes from the ability to link this data on whether parliaments were closed and the other data I'll look at later to other kind of external data sources. And the first of those is the IPU Parline data, which is data on system type. So that allows us to produce visualizations like this. So this is an alluvial plot, which allows us to see a flow from one variable, in this case, system type, over to another variable, so whether Parliament was closed in that system. And what this plot shows is actually that system type makes no difference at all to the kind of incidences of Parliament being closed or not. So we can see 62% of parliamentary systems remained open and 63% of presidential and 63% of semi-presidential systems remained open. So this is a very nice, colourful, pretty plot to show that system type doesn't really matter. But this yes-no variable allows that variable, so the yes-no variable, to be modelled using a thing called a logistic regression. Some of you might be familiar with that, others not so. And that returns a probability of whether a parliament closed for a given value of one or more explanatory variables. And that sounds perhaps stupidly complex to some of you, but hopefully as we go through, you'll see that it's not all that complex. And it's just a way of producing kind of probabilities of a parliament being open or a parliament closed. So I model this variable using three external data sets. And the first of these is a measure of authoritarianism, and that's the freedom score from the Freedom House resource. And this is a score between 0 for a country that is completely unfree up to 100 for completely free countries. And it's important to note that to avoid changes to the freedom score that resulted from a response to the pandemic, we used measures from no later than 2019, and that becomes important in maybe 6 or 7 slides time. So park that in your mind, and we'll return to some of the problems of using that approach. So the scores in a system range from 9 for China all the way up to a maximum of 100 for Finland, Norway, and Sweden. And the plot shows a negative correlation between freedom score and the likelihood of Parliament having been closed. So in plain language, as a freedom in a country increases, Parliament having closed becomes less likely. So a country with a freedom score similar to China is estimated to have a probability that their parliament closed of around 63%, and this falls to around 35% for those with the highest possible freedom scores. And moving on to the second measure, and this is the World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index score, and I won't get into too much detail about how that index score is produced, but it uses 8 dimensions to estimate a country's adherence to the rule of law. So it returns a score of 0 when there's no adherence, and 1 for a country which adheres perfectly. And the range of scores in the LAC19 sample of these 39 countries is more compact than with the freedom score. So the score ranges from 0.39 up to 0.89. And the plot shows a stronger negative correlation than with the freedom score. So again, in simple language, as adherence to the rule of law increases, the probability that Parliament closed reduces. So we see the probability of Parliament having closed falls from 63% at the lower range of scores to below 25% up at the upper limit. And the final variable that I looked at was inequality. And I use the Gini coefficient estimated by the World Bank for this. There is a measure of income inequality for a country, and it runs from 0 for a country with perfect income equality up to 100 for a country in which just one person holds all of the income. So the scores in the sample range from 27 for Belgium, which is the most equal, up to over 53 for Brazil, which is the most unequal. And we see this positive relationship. So as income equality increases, so does the probability that the parliament in the country close due to the pandemic. So again, from 25% in the most equal systems up to nearly 75% in the most unequal systems. So kind of what does all of these graphs mean? What do all my kind of words mean as I was going along? And really, proponents of greater freedom, adherence to the rule of an increased income equality will like what I've just presented. I mean, clearly the analysis is limited. I'm using a series of bivariate kind of analyses on 39 different countries, but parliaments were more likely to have remained open in systems that were more free, in systems that show greater adherence to the rule of law, and in countries where income equality is higher. So I think these are important findings for shaping perhaps the society, for shaping systems to ensure that parliaments can remain open and operational during future crises. So having examined whether parliament's closed or not, I'll finish this first part of the presentation focusing on the 16 parliaments that did close. And the LAC-19 network allowed for the dates of closure and reopening to be collected. And from this, I was able to kind of calculate the number of days that parliament were closed. So here's a bar chart showing the 16 examples. So it ranges from 7 days for Costa Rica, where they kind of decamped to a nearby museum, up to 194 days for the Canadian Parliament. And we measured closures from the day that Parliament was officially closed to the date that an official statement declared Parliament was open again. And this is, again, important for what I'm going to talk about in a few slides' time. So, again, jot that down and take note of it. So what I wanted to do, again, was interesting predictors of the longer closures. Why are we seeing this range of differences? So I used the same measures that I've just used on whether parliaments were open and closed. And what I find, so if we concentrate on the left graph at the moment, and what I should say here is this shows a linear regression rather than a logistic regression. It doesn't really matter. You see exactly the same sort of thing. But in the left, we see this weak negative correlation. And so a higher freedom score is associated with slightly shorter closures. But what is immediately noticeable, if we look in the top right-hand corner, is Canada kind of is so far away from this trend line. So that made me a bit kind of curious about what was going on. So I ran the analysis again without Canada this time. And it's quite remarkable. We said real strengthening of this negative relationship. I don't talk about statistical significance, but it becomes a statistically significant finding. So that starts getting me wondering what's going on with Canada. And it's a similar story with a rule of law score. Okay, we're not seeing the same effect, but you've got the plot on the left with Canada, and again you can see it's an outlier in the top right-hand corner. Once removed, we see the strengthening of the correlation. So by now I'm thinking, okay, Canada, what do we do? Do we completely ignore this case, or do we start focusing in on it a bit? And again, the same with inequality. And although inequality is a particularly poor predictor, removing Canada actually changes the direction of the effect, which is quite important. So we'll move on to kind of, again, what does this mean? And let's start with the analysis. This is a clear relationship between greater freedom in a country and shorter parliamentary closures. But I think it needs a more complex kind of analysis to draw out some of these pieces of information. What is more important, certainly for me looking at this, and for many of you will be looking at this, what's going on with Canada. We've got a country that is very free, that adheres highly to kind of a rule of law and which is relatively equal, yet Parliament is closed for 6 months. So what's going on? And this is where I think LAC-19 or the LAC-19 resource, both with the qualitative reports and the more quantitative data sets, really comes into its own. And it allows you to start picking into particular areas of reports and delve into what exactly is going on. So let's do that. So the curious case of Canada, yeah. So what is what is going on. And the first thing we have to do when we're seeing such an outlier, as Canada clearly so obviously is to look at our own data collection and the validity of a data used as an explanatory variable. And I delivered a version of this presentation at a conference last week to a room full of lawyers and philosophers. And the first question was from a philosopher who asked me a question I'd never really considered. And he asked me whether I thought that the freedom and rule of law scores were accurate for Canada. So I gave a kind of answer that we all give when we're not expecting a question of, you know, that's an interesting question, and to give you a little bit of thinking time. And then I pushed back and said, well, yeah, of course it is. And he said something really interesting of, well, given the vaccine mandates in the country and the recent crackdown on protests, you know, the bridge protests, the truckers protests, whatever you want to call it, they're not the sort of actions you'd expect to see from countries with a high freedom score or a country that adheres closely to the rule of law. Now, I'm not entirely convinced, I wasn't entirely convinced then, I'm still not entirely convinced now, but of this argument. It does show that some limitations of using these measures that were in place before the pandemic. We're losing a little bit of context with that. But again, I'm not sure there's an easy way out of this, and it's perhaps something we have to consider. I think it's well worth mentioning in the case of this. The second area to examine is whether my measures of the number of days of closure is correct. And here the report, so the LAC-19 country report, tells us something interesting. And it shows that Parliament, the National Parliament in Canada, actually operated for 3 full days on a semi-official footing during this period of closure between mid-March 2020 and September of the same year. And during these sessions, the government actually used this unanimous consent procedure to fast-track COVID-19 legislation. And this allowed debate to be quite severely curtailed, and also a smaller number of members being present in the chamber than would normally be the case. And also the report reported on some complaints by opposition parties that members representing Ontario and Quebec were disproportionately represented in these sessions. So again, we're seeing something that perhaps if we were just looking at the context, the lack of context in quantitative data draws it out. And finally, it also seems that federalism might have played a part in allowing the country to continue to operate despite this really long closure. So we asked in the LAC-19 reports, we asked the rapporteurs to report on 2 regions in the federal system. So what the Canada report shows, going in the wrong direction suddenly. Okay, let me, while I'll talk, while I don't think I did click on that, but okay, let's, oh, here we go, we're back. I must have knocked it somehow. So, okay, so what we see is that the Parliament in Ontario continued to meet throughout the first wave, so they had no break at all. And the British Columbia Parliament was only suspended for 2 weeks before being fully operational. So this is really interesting. So we already know that that federalism has helped subnational actors mitigate the actions of presidents, not least in the US and Brazil, where state and regional governors were able to push back against some, I don't know how you want to term the denial, some of the strange stuff that perhaps they weren't happy about. But this seems to suggest that actually subnational parliaments continued to meet might have mitigated some of the closures at the national level. So again, this starts to have this go between the quantitative data and the qualitative data. Okay, so we've already seen this slide moving up once, but we'll return to it in terms of, so let's move away a bit from this binary approach, as I say, of closure versus not closure, which tells us a bit about what was going on at the systemic level, but perhaps misses some of the nuance. So we're looking at reduced operations, and in particular, the reduction of debates in committees. So we see that 26 of the 39 parliaments saw proceedings reduced in some way, and 14 of those were either debate or committees were reduced, and then 12 we saw both debates and committees. So if we focus on debates to start with, and again, I used a logistic regression to model these reductions, but graphs showing probabilities for numerous categories start to get really messy, and I didn't want to put these up on the screen and kind of get people confused and not knowing what they were looking at. So I'll just list the probabilities this time. So if we start looking at the system type, so there's a 76% probability that debate was reduced in parliamentary systems. However, this drops down to 37% probability in both presidential and semi-presidential systems. So again, it's quite a significant fall and starts to raise questions about what we're seeing here. For government type, we actually have to look at parliamentary systems and presidential, semi-presidential systems differently. So in parliamentary systems with coalition government at the start of the pandemic, we see this probability of debate having been reduced like really high, 89%, yet single party government in parliamentary systems is only a 40% prediction or probability of debate having been reduced. And again, with the presidential systems where government was divided, that is, different parties hold the executive and control the legislature, we see a 40% probability that there was a reduction in debate. Yet, when it was unified government, so the same party controlled both the executive and the legislature, we see that probability to drop to 16%. So, again, what are we seeing here? And it appears that when there's more parties either in government as a coalition or controlling the different parties controlling the executive and the legislature, we're seeing a greater probability of debates being reduced. And this seems a counterintuitive finding, certainly to me as a political scientist. I'd have expected it to be more likely that debate was reduced to stifle scrutiny when just one party was in government. However, it might be that with greater control, either through having a majority in Parliament or controlling the two branches of government, that the parties were much more comfortable in allowing this broader debate to happen, knowing that they could control it at the back end. And again, this needs much greater analysis. So, and then let's move on to the second kind of reduction in parliamentary process, and that's the committees. So the first thing to note is that in parliamentary systems, there was a 43% probability that committee proceedings were reduced, so far less than the likelihood of debates being reduced. Yet in the presidential system, it's slightly higher at 50% chance of committees being reduced. Yet in semi-presidential systems, it was a 0% probability using our data. So there was 8 semi-presidential systems and not one of them reduced the committee. Now that might be a kind of fluke of the 8 systems we've got, or there might be something going on there that needs clearly much greater analysis. And finally, with the government type, what we find is that government type isn't associated with differences in the reduction of committees. So there's no change across the government type, unlike with the debate. So again, how do we interpret these findings? Well, it's clear that committee proceedings were far less likely to have been subjected to reductions in parliamentary systems and debates. And maybe I think this tells us something about the central role of committees in many parliamentary systems. However, there's always a however with this kind of data. It might just be simply logistics, and it was much easier to ensure the continuation of committees given the smaller number of members present than in plenary debates, and a deeper analysis of the use of hybrid proceedings would be needed to answer that. Luckily for all of you, this is the exact sort of thing that we include in the LAC-19 data, and although it's beyond the scope of what I'm talking about today, if you are interested in that, by all means, that's the sort of data we're going to be producing. Okay, so let's just move on to the third and final area, and that's the kind of oversight of COVID-19 measures. And we asked rapporteurs to record the use of committees to scrutinise COVID-19 measures. We also asked them to make a distinction to be made between committees set up for the sole purpose of scrutinising the pandemic response or whether existing committees were used for this purpose. So let's start by examining the formation of specific committees for scrutiny of COVID-19 measures. And there were 11 such committees formed in the 39 countries, and 10 of those were in parliamentary systems. So there's only Chile that was forming this sort of committee in a non-parliamentary system. Presidential and semi-presidential systems were slightly more likely to use existing committees for oversight of COVID-19 measures. So we got the presidential systems of Argentina and Costa Rica, which use our existing committee system to scrutinise measures, but only Austria of a semi-presidential system. So all in of the 19 systems that use some form of committee to specifically scrutinised COVID-19 measures. 14 were in parliamentary systems. So let's move to the final slide. So again, interpretation, I think, of this is difficult. I mean, there's some evidence of higher numbers of COVID-19 oversight committees being formed under coalition government, and that's my own analysis of that, and that fits in with what is already known about how the committee process is central to managing coalition government from the legislative studies literature. And we might be seeing that in this parliamentary versus presidential, semi-presidential divide. I'm not quite convinced of that, but I'm not sure. So again, we need to be going into it. And likewise, we might want to look at what is going on with Chile in the same way that we looked at Canada, or look at Austria and why that's the only semi-presidential system to use committees. And as I say, luckily for you, the LAC-19 resource is the perfect way to answer these sorts of questions. And really, as Octavio finished his presentation with, we really do hope you can take advantage of what we think is a fantastic resource. For feedback we've got, they said it's a pretty good resource too, so it's not just us blowing our own trumpets. So yeah, please come and use it. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Andrew. Now we have Professor Jeff King with us. So I would like to present you. Professor Jeff King is professor at University College London, Faculty of Law. Now the word is with you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to this topic, and I'd like to thank my longstanding colleague, friend, collaborator, Octavio, also for the invitation to be able to speak about this in Brazil, which is a real treat. And thanks to Andrew for setting us up. And apologies for entering a little bit later. I think I had misunderstood the correct start time, but hopefully that won't affect anything else in what I'm about to say. So without any further ado, let me share my screen and speak to the topic of comparative approaches to emergency powers as a response to COVID-19. And what I want to do while discussing this topic is essentially to look at the idea of emergency powers, different models for theorizing what constitutional emergency powers are for, and the different forms that they can take, and then looking specifically at the general responses that we're seeing across the 38 countries that we have in the study so far, and see whether there are certain lessons that emerge from the different approaches that countries have taken, the different forms of supervision by parliaments of the exercise of emergency powers, whether there were strong trends regarding outcomes and so on. And what I'll be arguing ultimately is that essentially the view that the pandemic was used or would be used as a pretext to invoke the most invasive and far-reaching forms of emergency powers, that fear was not entirely realized. It wasn't even generally realized in the comparative approaches that we've surveyed, first of all. Secondly, that there was a tendency to use statutory emergency powers as opposed to constitutional emergency powers. And that's a response that I tend to endorse as the best form of response to the pandemic. And also that there was a tendency in the responses for most countries to resort to the most invasive tool of managing the pandemic, namely lockdowns or stay-at-home orders, and that there's no strong correlation between whether a country was a rule of law abiding country or a democratic country and was a country that would adopt a stay-at-home order, which is quite invasive. So there's a lot of interesting data in here that intersects with some common myths and some common fears about the use of emergency powers in a health context. So let me first begin by looking at a typology of emergency powers. This might be familiar to many, but essentially theorists have suggested three broad approaches to how emergency powers would be exercised by the state. The first being the neo-Roman or constitutional dictatorship model, under which the fundamental difference in the role of the legislature and the president in such a system, or the prime minister, as the case may be, is that the legislature would authorize the period of emergency, but then the person exercising the emergency powers would have an almost entirely free rein on what is done during that period. So the idea is that simply that there is a periodic check by the legislature, but the president or prime minister, whoever it is, would essentially just govern during those periods and not be subject to strong oversight by the legislature. So that is one model. And that model is constitutional and a dictatorship, I should add, before I get on to the next model, because it is all provided for by law. The Constitution ratifies this kind of approach, and whatever it is that the leader is doing during those periods of authorized emergency is at least in principle bound by law. Another model says that essentially the extra legal measures model suggests that ordinarily a legal order is going to be suspended during the emergency period, and the executive will have to take far-reaching control of the political order. And the maxim, the Latin maxim that necessity knows no law, is the driving idea for this category of emergency powers. And one would expect that few constitutional lawyers would want to endorse the extra legal measures model, because it looks like a license, and it in fact is a license for the executive power to do anything that it feels is necessary to do during this period of emergency. And therefore, it's not rule of law bound at all. However, there are a number of lawyers that effectively recommend that emergencies should be understood to lie outside the law entirely. And the reason that they offer for that position is that if you try to control emergency powers with law, the effect of doing that is that you will contaminate the normal legal order. You'll normalize the use of emergency powers that have no place in the normal legal order. I can give an example in the context of national security. The idea that has been proposed and given legislative effect in the United Kingdom and other countries of having secret trials in order to provide some veneer of legal accountability over the executive when it is exercising national security powers. The idea of doing that has been strongly criticized by advocates of this extra legal measures model, like Orrin Gross in the United States, because they think that what it does is it makes normal distortions to the law, such as people having their rights affected through legal procedures in which those people can't participate, for instance. So the fear with the extra legal measures model in the COVID-19 context is that by trying to provide a legal framework for the exercise of these extensive executive powers, one might be distorting the normal legal regime. And so on this view, you should probably not try to legally regulate much of what happens during the pandemic. A third model is essentially not too dissimilar to what I just described regarding national security in the UK and in some other legal orders. So the business as usual or rule of law model says that regular civil society institutions will continue to operate, the courts will stay open, the judges will supervise the executive, legal accountability structures will remain, but you'll need to make some adjustments to how it works. So the classic example of an adjustment in the UK would be to move to online courts. The adjustment in the national security context was to have to allow so-called secret trials to proceed, where the state would appoint representatives of the suspected terrorists, and you'd have legal proceedings, but the suspected terrorist himself or herself wasn't a part of those proceedings. So that's the rule of law model. You try to have as many elements of law in the picture as you can. Now, for the COVID-19 pandemic, there is perhaps some argument about whether the neo-Roman model applied in certain legal orders. There is perhaps a weak argument that the state did essentially what it wanted and maybe decorated what it did with a certain amount of law under the extra legal measures model. My impression of having read so many state reports is essentially that the rule of law model, that is a model in which the states that we examined attempted to work within a legal framework and rule by regulations, keep the courts open, keep legislatures open, to make and repeal law on a regular basis, that was the dominant model that was followed in most countries, and appropriately so, in my view. Let's look a bit more at some of the data that we have. Now, there's two important questions that are antecedent to looking at some of the data with respect to how emergency powers were used. One is, what is relevant here to whether a state performs well at managing the pandemic? Because if you're looking at emergency powers, there's always a question about whether, even if some approaches seem to be more rule of law respectful or more process oriented, there was more deliberation, there was more time taken, were those measures adopted at the expense of a good management of the pandemic itself? Were they hostile, in other words, to a good public health response to the pandemic? So it raises the question of what the relationship is between an effective response at managing the pandemic and respect for rule of law, civil liberties, and democratic norms. So I think, and in some of the work I've presented earlier on this, that a good pandemic response entails effective pandemic management, that is managing transmission rates and treating those who become ill. And we can assess whether states are good at that by looking at a variety of things: infection rates, fatality. I think the most reliable indicator of an effective public health response to the management at this point is people agree that excess mortality is the best indicator of this type of the effectiveness of the response, because excess mortality rates, where they're available, don't tend to lie in the way that some of these other rates might. Either states might be lying about it or just unable to collect the data effectively. So an effective pandemic management system is probably one that keeps excess mortality rates low, at the very least. And another aspect of a good response is that it is politically legitimate. And that means that management decisions are taken in a manner that's democratic, transparent, accountable, and rights consistent in a procedural and a substantive sense. If our understanding of what a good response is that it's both effective at managing the pandemic and legitimate in the political sense, it raises the question, obviously, of whether effectiveness and legitimacy come into conflict. And in our review of the evidence, and not having done, at this stage, a very, very comprehensive regression analysis, we can certainly look at some correlations between these two types of characteristics, that is, effectiveness and legitimate responses, by taking some proxies: democratic performance, rule of law performance, and respect for civil liberties and human rights. And we can look at what the correlation is between these types of things to see whether or not there's any correlation between a state being more heavy-handed or authoritarian in its politics and an effective pandemic response. And we can also look at whether countries that were more libertarian in their approach, that is, less likely to adopt things like stay-at-home orders, were in any way better at managing the pandemic. And the overall conclusion is that when you look at the data, there's little reason to think that effective pandemic management and respect for human rights and the rule of law actually come into conflict. And the upshot of that is, we can say that looking at political legitimacy on its own is a very worthwhile endeavor, because we can say that basically since we know that politically legitimate responses don't seem to have an adverse impact on the effectiveness of pandemic responses, we can argue that a state is better off, all things considered, respecting human rights, respecting the rule of law, and respecting democratic norms as part of its pandemic response. This stuff matters, and it's not hostile to effective pandemic responses. Okay. So this chart shows us the relationship between many countries, not just those in the COVID-19 and the LAC-19 cohort, between the civil liberties score for the Freedom House, which is flawed, but it generally is consistent with many rankings in other countries, and excess deaths per 100,000. You can see a moderate negative correlation, that is, countries that experienced a higher level of excess mortality also tended to do more poorly where they had, they have a poor respect for civil liberties. The question of causation here is, of course, it's very important. All this chart is meant to show that particularly authoritarian nations are not correlated with a better response to the pandemic in terms of keeping excess deaths low. To the contrary, we can look at a few others now. Just looking at the cohort of countries that are in the LAC-19 study, we can see that the relationships even are slightly stronger here. Now that we're looking at a smaller set of countries in our study, those countries that tended to be more authoritarian also had significant problems with excess mortality. And those countries that are clustered around this area, which tend to show greater respect for human rights, had lower forms of excess mortality. This is the same chart, but looking now at respect for the rule of law, taking the indicators from the World Justice Project. So we'll see quite that the rule of law respecting countries and the human rights respecting countries tended to do fairly well at keeping excess mortality down, at least in our study. It does raise the question, though, whether the conclusion we should draw is that the more libertarian or liberal a country becomes, does it become better at managing the pandemic? In other words, should we be tending towards really robust versions of the right to liberty and the rule of law? And the answer seems to be that, at least in our study, there's no statistically significant relationship between a state's rule of law performance and its decision of whether to impose a stay-at-home order. In other words, countries that performed well in their human rights and civil liberties scores were also very, very open to using the most intrusive public health measure, which is the stay-at-home order. So for those left critics, for instance, of the discourse of human rights and the rule of law, if they think that talking about human rights and the rule of law means you're going to tend towards libertarian responses to public health problems, the data doesn't seem to be there, at least not in the project that we're looking at. Okay, so just wanted to indicate before moving on that we have in our study of the countries we're looking at so far, there's quite a distribution across the spectrum of countries in terms of their rule of law ranking. So we have a good number of numbers, not too many at very low in terms of rule of law ranking, but we have a number of well-distributed categories for respect for the rule of law, which gives us some confidence that the cohort is reasonable for extracting some generalizations, even if the overall numbers are still low at this point. Democratic quality, this slide is really to show you how we decided that we couldn't really come to trust the Polity Index, which is a commonly used index amongst political scientists to assess the quality of democracy in different countries. We did look at our distribution across the Polity Index. There's no doubt that our group of countries tends towards slightly more democratic, at least in the initial group that is represented here. But if you were to look at other indicators for democracy like VDEM and others, you'll see that we do have a fairly good distribution of democratic performance across the countries in our cohort, notwithstanding the way that the polity score represents this indicator has come into question lately. So all this is to say, despite what this slide is showing, that the countries in our cohort represent the variety of rule of law and democratic performance that one sees across the world generally fairly well. Now, I wanted to share the next few slides, just some data in order to demonstrate that in Europe, at least, where there is a high degree of convergence politically, legally, and democratically, there is a wide difference in how infection traveled and how deaths took place. I start with a simple epidemic curve from the United Kingdom to show just how high the rates were for infection. This is confirmed COVID-19 cases per million, just to familiarize the people that may be watching this with an epidemic curve. I'm going to add now France and Germany, and you can see that the peaks don't correspond particularly well for France and the United Kingdom, which have similar population size, similar population density, and are geographically quite close to each other. Nevertheless, the different responses in France, which is red in this chart, and the United Kingdom, which is this sort of grayish line, you can see significant variation in how the pandemic was managed. In particular, in this portion, these gaps here are very, very substantial. France was stronger in its approach to managing the pandemic. We can see most graphically the difference that policy has made by comparing two Scandinavian countries, which are similar in terms of population. Sweden's significantly larger, but still under 10 million people in Sweden, from Norway. But here are two countries that took a different approach to managing the pandemic. Sweden was much more lax and rested on the good sense of its population and didn't use very strong directive measures like shop closures, whereas Norway adopted many of those. It didn't go all the way to a strict stay-at-home order, but it did adopt more stricter measures, as did Denmark and Finland. And you can see here that there's a huge difference in the number of infections in the middle part of the pandemic, where the correlation between infection and death was quite high. And if we look at cumulative death rates per million, here you can see a huge variation within Europe, but also in other countries that are politically similar to some European countries like Australia and New Zealand, all the way down here. Norway is here. And you can see that the United Kingdom's choices were led to a very, very high death rate from COVID-19. France has done poorly, but that is a significant measure of improvement over the UK. And Sweden, which is quite politically like Norway, has a very poor performance here as well, much poorer than, say, Germany and the Netherlands even, which are vastly more densely populated than is Sweden. So all this to say that the legal measures that were taken in these countries seem to matter. Let's get on to looking at these legal measures. So one question for us in the LAC-19 study is what kinds of declarations were used. So relatively few countries in this survey of 38 actually relied exclusively on constitutional declarations of emergency powers. It was, as you can see here, Chile, Ethiopia, Serbia, and Spain did. There was a reliance in the countries in this column on both constitutional and statutory emergency powers. But for a significant bulk of the countries, there was a reliance either on using declarations that were issued under statutes or not having declarations play a role at all in these categories. So the quick rush to a constitutional state of exception in either the extra legal measures model of constitutional powers or the neo-Roman dictatorship, these were not chosen by and large in these countries. The vast majority of countries went with public health legislation that provided for a statutory declaration or just avoided the discourse of declarations of emergency altogether. Brazil and Argentina are complex cases. I don't want to begin to try to explain the situation in Brazil to this audience, but we've had some internal discussions about this, and it was declared via decree, as you would all know, and so it doesn't quite fit this model so simply. Now, what about system type? I can't do this project with Andrew and not have to disaggregate the data in this kind of way. So you'd expect possibly that parliamentary systems would be more hesitant to declare emergencies than presidential ones, which are used to a sort of exercise of very robust executive power. We did find that presidential systems were declaring emergencies and semi-presidential as well, but there was nothing hugely significant statistically in the difference between presidential and parliamentary regimes in terms of the resort to emergency powers. And indeed, in semi-presidential systems, you'll see that actually that fewer countries adopted a declaration of emergency than those that did. So we don't see too much evidence here that the sort of classic image of the presidential system with the strongman leader, where we're diving straight into the use of extensive emergency powers. I mean, we're not trying to draw on such a limited basis a sweeping generalization here, but the evidence doesn't suggest that classic form of strongman resort to powers. And so we can see the same information here now presented in an alluvial chart, which graphically shows that what I was just explaining. Although here we can see the presidential systems were likely to go with, there was still a strong majority going with the adoption of emergency powers. It's still, as we'll see in a moment, that it is divided between not having a declaration of emergency and having one, and the semi-presidential systems, which are said to suffer from the same vices, go the other way. So overall, it's hard to draw the conclusion that there's a quick reach for sweeping executive constitutional emergency powers in these systems. As we can see here, furthermore, the presidential systems also tended to use statutory emergency powers as well as constitutional ones. So even for those countries that did go with emergency powers, they didn't reach necessarily for the constitutional state of exception model when doing it. So when we're thinking about the different kinds of public health interventions that states have used, I just wanted to put this slide up for a couple of moments to remind the audience that this is the stuff that we were looking at. We essentially were looking at 10 public health interventions. These are the 10. We settled these in long discussions between the editors of the Lex Atlas, and we are gathering data on all of these measures and looking at them. I'm going to talk a bit about the stay-at-home measure, the first one of these in particular, but I'll also be looking at the way in which the law was made and the accountability processes that parliaments exercised over the process. So let's look at stay-at-home orders for a moment. This is a simple chart, a table which illustrates which countries decided to adopt stay-at-home orders, that is, to insist that their populations remain indoors, not leave their home for a certain amount of time, and those countries that avoided using these orders. And what we've concluded is that there is no particularly strong relationship between whether a country is authoritarian or a consolidated democracy and their decision to go with a stay-at-home order. It seems that the decisions were influenced by other considerations. It could be political culture, or probably its biggest influence is the extent to which the epidemiological threat was perceived to require a stay-at-home order. There are probably some examples in countries, perhaps in the United States and certain states, where stay-at-home orders were avoided on ideological grounds. But in the states that we looked at, they were quick to adopt stay-at-home orders to deal with the pandemic. So no strong link between using stay-at-home orders and authoritarian tendencies, or the lack of using stay-at-home orders and a libertarian form of politics. Judicial review, we saw there was a maintenance of a system of judicial review across the countries that we looked at. So no strong retreat from judicial review, except for in countries where that could be expected anyway. The courts remained open for business. Some people might argue that the judges bowed out of the process. They showed no effective resistance. We can remember that public law accountability is one form of civil justice in a democracy, keeping the courts open for things like family law, ordinary civil disputes, evictions, and so on. That is an extremely important part of the rule of law, and nearly all of the countries took measures to ensure that the ordinary operation of civil justice continued. But on the judicial review of public health measures in particular, so far as we can tell, meaningful judicial review continued to take place. Very few measures were struck down during that period, but that's not, so far as we can tell, not incompatible with the ordinary approach that judges would take towards such important public health measures in non-emergency time periods. So not too much evidence here that the courts bowed out completely of the picture. We'd have to go doctrinally jurisdiction by jurisdiction to see whether they did less than they should have done. There's a debate in the UK, just to take one jurisdiction, where some argue that the courts bowed out of it, but that is not my view. Doctrinally, I think the courts here essentially did exactly what one would have expected them to do according to the doctrine that pre-existed the arrival of the pandemic. Suspensions of bills of rights. Very few countries did this formally. It has to be said, in some of these countries, the existence of the Bill of Rights being in force is not much of a constraint on the government anyway. So there's not much truck in suspending the bills of rights. But generally speaking, the bills of rights were left in place and constitutional litigation took place in most of the countries where one would expect that the courts would ordinarily show some sort of robust resistance to the government. Elections, this is something where I think it does illustrate that there was an element of business as usual. So you can see here that in the period, during the pandemic period, a very significant number of countries held elections. National elections are represented here in gray. Referendums were held in 10% of the countries. Provincial and regional elections were held on schedule. And remember, a number of countries didn't have elections actually scheduled during that time. So that's something to bear in mind. The elections postponed category is even more informative because it tells you basically those countries that that put off the election on the pretext of the pandemic. And here we can see that national elections were only postponed in about 12% of the cases, which is an indicator that most countries continued to hold elections and not disrupt the political process that much. In some countries, the decision to hold an election was actually viewed as regressive because people were not as prepared as they might be for an election time. The fear was that other parties couldn't campaign properly and there was an advantage to the incumbent. But in many other countries, elections took place and turnout was actually in some cases higher than it was in non-pandemic times. So I was a bit surprised by this information. Another thing we saw was that we tried to evaluate whether the responsiveness to the government's attitudes was, whether one could see a degree of resistance to what the government was doing, through the proxy of looking at whether people objected to the adoption of a particular kind of legal measure, which is what I'm calling a COVID responsive general statute. And this is again, to take the UK, there's a Coronavirus Act that was fast-tracked through Parliament. There's a Corona law in Norway. There are similar measures in Israel. These are laws essentially that were passed hastily in most cases, but were designed all-purpose legal frameworks for dealing with COVID-19 in particular. And we asked for information about whether members of the legislature opposed the introduction of the bill, and found it quite interesting to note that of the 19 countries that relied on COVID-19 responsive statutes or some combination of a pre-existing statute and a newly passed one, the challenges to the adoption of the new statutes, only strong political opposition only really arose in Israel, the Netherlands, and Serbia. In most of the other countries, there was something approaching a political consensus on the need for the statutes, as well as an agreement with most of the substance of those statutes. And I did have you could probably call it misfortune of being part of the parliamentary response in the UK at the time this bill sailed through the fast-tracked Parliament. It fast-tracked through the Parliament. And you could see the different parties were not happy about the timetable of it being passed, but largely agreed on the content of the actual measures that went through. One interesting question in comparative studies is the extent of legislative scrutiny of the making of COVID-19 regulations or decrees. So in every country we looked at, the primary legal response to the pandemic in terms of providing for those 10 public health interventions that I put up on a slide a few minutes ago was done through decrees, delegated legislation, regulations, and so on. And an interesting comparative question is, does the legislature have an oversight role on that decree-making process? In every case, the legislators are allowed to make interpellations. They're allowed to make comments on what the government is doing with them. But in some countries, the legislature is entitled to exercise scrutiny. It can either exercise negative scrutiny, that is, the measure is made into law, but there is a period of time after it's made into law where the legislature can cause the measure to lapse. It can negative it. Secondly, there's an affirmative procedure, which means the legislature has to approve the measure before it comes into law. And then there's a variety of approaches that mix either negative and affirmative forms of scrutiny. And we can see in the far column here that that a number of countries had a somewhat mixed approach. In many countries, only a few measures were subject to an affirmative resolution process. Many were subject to a negative resolution process where the legislature could negative the measure after it comes into force. But actually, the majority of countries had no parliamentary oversight of individual regulations whatsoever. And that is interesting because in the UK, for instance, there is a robust anger almost politically that Parliament was marginalized in the making of the regulations, the oversight process of them, because the regulations came so quickly to Parliament and there wasn't enough time to properly understand them, during the process of oversight. But in fact, many countries had no such oversight at all. My experience is that despite the complaints in the UK, a system in which the public health measures go before the legislature and are in principle open to commentary or even control seemed to work. It seemed to provide a layer of accountability that was better than a system in which such accountability doesn't happen. Now, I think my time has run out, so I wanted to proceed to some conclusions. Moving quickly, I think that a rule of law framework is better for a public health crisis such as COVID-19 to a framework that emphasizes a state of exception or a constitutional dictatorship model. The countries that responded reasonably well definitely followed that model. They used a legal framework and did not try to step outside of it. Secondly, the more tailored or extensive legislative frameworks seem to be superior to the less tailored or the more ambiguous or vague legislative frameworks. So adopting more tailored legislation allows the legislatures to focus on pertinent questions and provide more opportunities for them to give input on the shape of the measures that were actually used. So I favor a statutory approach in using more extensive legislation than a constitutional approach, or even a statutory approach, which is contained in a very short bill conferring wide regulation-making powers. Thirdly, that legislative rather than constitutional emergency powers frameworks allow for more legislative input into the scheme of powers without reducing parliamentary scrutiny of the exercise of those powers. So more in favor of a statutory approach. Fourthly, that the use of sunset periods on emergency declarations, statutes, and the COVID-19 regulations themselves were widely used and very appropriate. And the periods ranged from anything from 2 to 3, from a month all the way to a year. In my view, those periods that were longer than 3 months seem to be unnecessarily long. Just 3 more points here to wrap up. Statutory public health frameworks are better and more amply tailored than constitutional frameworks. That parliamentary scrutiny of regulations is better than systems that don't have such scrutiny. Although I need to add a footnote to that statement, which is that political systems are complex in the modes of accountability they develop. It can be that a system that doesn't have scrutiny of an actual public health intervention measure, let's say it's a stay-at-home order adopted by decree, may have other features in its system, like a very constrained period for the exercise of emergency powers, or a more robust form of interpellation, or a different electoral system. So it's hard to generalize too strongly about this 6th point. And lastly, the role of parliaments in reviewing public health regulations can be strengthened through a variety of techniques, including resort to more invigorated parliamentary committees and sunset periods that require the renewal of measures. I think that the opposition parties should, in all cases, be involved upstream in the decision-making process about the need to resort to urgent regulation making. That is, the opposition parties, I think, should be an early part of the conversation with the government, where it is believed by the government that urgent public health measures are going to have to be made. And that I have not seen provision for that in virtually any of the countries that we've looked at. So it's, I think, an area of policy reform. Okay, I'll stop there, and many apologies if I've gone over time.
Thank you, Professor Jeff. You give us a lot of new data to measure how the different countries around the world with different political models have been responding to COVID-19 around the world, and the impact of different types of democracy on government's response. Now, I give the word to Siri. Thank you very much, Professor Siri Glopen, for being here with us today. Siri Glopen, who is also FGV Law School Global Senior Fellowship. And if I'm not wrong, your first visit to our school had been in 2011 during the International Political Science Association Congress here in São Paulo, so more than 10 years ago. Thank you very much, Siri. It's with you.
Thank you so much, Luciana. It would have been, I really realized how much I missed you all. It would have been nice to be there, but this is a great opportunity to engage on an extremely, of course, important issue, but it's an enormously impressive and valuable initiative. The LAC19, but I love the acronym because I always get the order mixed up. I've been following it since the start and looking at the websites and what you presented. And as Octavio says, this is the first opportunity to really engage with this in some more depth. And it is, I think there are so many things to say about it. And I just want to start by saying that of course, it is a unique, it was so extremely well conceived because it is a unique event that impacts more or less all countries in the world, not equally, but as equally as things can, and that it is a unique laboratory for understanding how systems respond to shocks. And to sort of see this while it is ongoing and be able to actually monitor it in real time is so rare. And of course, we all know that looking back is a lot less reliable than trying to sort of monitor things as it unfolds. So that's so important, but also that you actually make it publicly accessible in real time as well, or as real time as you can. But it is sort of, as soon as it's ready, it's made publicly available. Is such a rare contribution to the community. And I think that is, and it means a lot for scholars all around the world who often will not have access to these types of data. And it is already to some extent interdisciplinary, and I think it is a hugely important resource for interdisciplinary research. So I have a lot of comments, and I won't be able to give all my comments, but I'll give some to all of you. And on the sort of overall, I just have, I think, maybe some questions to start with to the overall project. And I really like the sort of efforts of trying to say not only what happened, what was the legislation, but also trying to analyze why, which differences within the systems have made countries respond so differently. And I think there's a lot more that can be done to that, and I'll come back to that. But I also would like to know a little bit more, because you said that you have ambitions of researching more on effects, different types of effects that these measures have. And I'd like to know a little bit more about that, because that also goes to the general issue of time. I know you started this really early, and from what you're saying, it also seems that the different chapters are being updated, but how long are you collecting data for? Because countries have responded very differently over time. And it would be really, and to sort of how long will this timeline continue, and how detailed will it be? I think that would be really useful to know. And also a little bit more about what type of effects. I also wondered about some of the definitions, like for instance, parliamentary lockdowns. If there are digital meetings, will that, or closing of parliaments, will, if the meetings of parliament continue but not in person, will that be sort of seen as a partial lockdown, or is that sort of, will they then be considered open? And then some of the other questions were answered. Yes, and I also like the very systematic way of researching why, because I think that, of course, political leadership is really important in the context of the pandemic, but that's something that I think we overemphasize, political will or unwill, and it is really interesting to look more in depth at the structural reasons for the different responses. One of the things that, of course, is difficult, but possible with the very sort of granular, more sort of contextual and qualitative material that you have, is to go more in depth on the baseline, which is also really different in different countries when it comes to emergency legislation. Like, for instance, I mean, I am from Norway, and we didn't have any emergency legislation in place at all. So we didn't have any constitutional provisions for emergency legislation. We couldn't, even if we wanted, have changed the constitution because that would have taken, we would have had to have an election in between. So that's also, while other countries would have sort of maybe several sets of prepared emergency legislation depending on the type of crisis. So I'm also wondering sort of, and also in terms of enabling legislation to sort of do a lot of measures within the existing law. So when Norway adopted a quite comprehensive COVID law, that was also because that there wasn't really any alternative to do things in a constitutional manner. And also, I think that what's also interesting to look at it is, of course, you look at federal systems versus unitary systems, but also the role of local governments vary a lot, and the responsibilities of local governments. And for instance, I know that Norway and Sweden is very different also in that respect, that local government has a lot of powers in Norway. While the bureaucracy and the experts have a lot more shielded powers in Sweden. So there are also, so I think generally to look at the interface between the legal system and the bureaucratic response, and how the bureaucratic system responded and protected itself or not during this period would be interesting to look at, and a fruitful ground for collaborative research across disciplines, because I think that the way in which law is translated into bureaucratic practice also differs a lot. And then another really interesting, there is so many things, so many thoughts that come from both your presentations, but one of the issues that have been discussed a lot in the pandemic, and that you didn't really speak about, but I'm sure you've been thinking a lot about it, is trust, the importance of trust, which comes into play in different places, both in terms of the need for strict measures is less. I mean, in some countries, you can just recommend people to stay at home and they will. In other countries, you can't. So the level of trust in society ex ante will have an impact on the measures that are in place. But at the same time, the measures will have an impact on the trust over time. So to look at sort of measures of level of trust in relation to the different measures that are being adopted, I think would also be super interesting. And another sort of maybe some of the most difficult, but also important issues is to see to look at the role of the health system and the build-up and capacity of the health system, and the capacity and the economic capacity of the government more generally. Because of course it's easier to sort of maintain strict measures and trust or legitimacy if you can compensate people economically, but also that it's easier if you can rely on if you have more of if you have a robust health system and you have a health system that has more political control than many countries have. So I think these, I'm sure you've been thinking about all these issues, but I think it would be super useful and interesting to try and explore more. One of the things that I was thinking about, Andrew, when you were discussing the issue of what the relationship between number of parties and coalition governments and whether Parliament was closed down or not, and also debate times and so on. I was just thinking, did you also look at whether it's it is a minority coalition or a majority coalition or a minority government or majority government? Because often, if you have a high number of parties, you end up with a minority coalition. And if you have a minority coalition, Parliament is super strong relative to the coalition. But if you have a majority coalition, all the debate tends to happen within the coalition. So I think that would be really interesting to try and tease out more if you want to look at those dynamics, but you might have done so already. Yes. I was also wondering about whether you've looked at the role of hearings, parliamentary hearings. Some countries have provisions that requires legislation and so on to go on here, and also some policy to go on hearings. And these are relatively time consuming and might be, to what extent, but also enable participation from both civil society more generally. So to what extent these have been upheld? There have been quite a lot of work is done on participatory mechanisms more generally, but I don't think that so much has been done on parliamentary hearings. So if you have any information on that, I think that would also be an interesting way of looking at to what extent participatory procedures have been in place. Yes, it's also super interesting that parliamentary committees are more often functioning than debate time, and partly it might be because it's a prior, that committees need to go first in most instances before the general plenary, but it's also interesting to see whether party elites are consolidating power more in this situation, so that and that the committees therefore will be more important. Yes. No, I think I'll I think I'll leave it at that, and then I'll come in with more. Maybe I'll come in with more comments, but I see that I've already been talking for 15 minutes, so I'll leave it for now.
Thanks, Siri. I think you can do a round of responses following the order of the presentation, as we don't have much time left, only 10 minutes, so please take time, Otávio.
I think I'll leave it for Jeff and Andrew to answer, because the questions are quite specific, and I spoke a lot already in the beginning. So thank you.
Andrew?
Okay, so I'll answer the kind of questions in ease of answer, I guess. So first up, in terms of the parliamentary lockdowns or closures, if they met virtually, then that was classed as the Parliament being open. So again, I guess I started from this whole process of thinking, it's dead easy. We're going to measure from the first moment they closed to the first moment they opened, and this would be really, really very simple measure. And it turned out to be anything but. I mean, China's a prime example of a parliament just doesn't meet like other parliaments. It meets like 2 or 3 times a year. So we're working through that. But yeah, in terms of that specific question, then yeah, the moment they went to hybrid or virtual, then it was open. I'll skip the trust question for now, because it's quite a tricky one, although I have looked at trust, and it's something that I've measured in work that I've done away from the LAC-19 project, and I'm very aware of that debate, and actually it came up in recent times that I gave this presentation. In terms of kind of a health system and all that systemic stuff, I guess the aim of many people is to kind of find this objectively right approach, whether that be how did Parliament operate, what was the right legal response to COVID, and then therefore you get this kind of outcome at the end of it, and we can all say yes, this is right, this is wrong. And I'm increasingly beginning to think that exactly what you're saying, that there's so many variables that are plugged into these sorts of models that you could only ever get to a sort of an answer of what was right for that particular country at that particular time. And I think that the LAC-19 project will help with that, not least because I think there's going to be a tendency for some countries to say, well, we could only deal with it in this way, and we'll be able to plug in to say, well, actually, wrong. You know, look, this country dealt with this and they've got a very similar system. But yeah, as I say, I'm beginning to move towards the idea that there's not an objectively right kind of answer and approach. In terms of minority majority coalitions, yeah, I have looked at it, and it washes away some of the results, and I wonder whether that's something to do with the sample we've got. You end up with it looking very much like Scandinavian countries with minority governments and New Zealand with minority governments versus the rest. And I wonder whether there's something that can be done there by broadening that sample of countries we look at. I was going to include some of it today, but it would have literally been points of me saying majority, minority didn't really matter. When I think it certainly does. I mean, not least leading on to the final point of parliamentary committees, we know that the reason that Norway is a prime example and can operate so well is they have these really strong committees, and Sweden's probably a little bit the same, where there's all these points of access for opposition parties to be able to influence the larger kind of legislative output. And yeah, my sense is that matters. And I wonder whether we're going to start seeing it a little bit with kind of the minority majority kind of coalition games that we're going to see of a response to the response of a pandemic, if that makes sense, in terms of how do you pay for it? What are some of the policy decisions that need to be made now in response to the policy decisions there? Okay, so I'll leave the rest for Jeff.
Jeff.
Thank you very much, Siri, for those comments. And I wanted to say thank you, especially for the really kind things that you said about the project generally. It's really it's heartwarming to hear that from a scholar of your caliber who's been looking at right to health and health and public law for such a long time. We really, just to say that the idea of making it publicly accessible, we knew from the very beginning was the sine qua non for the project. For us personally, that was the case from Octavio and I, but we knew also that we couldn't get so many great people from all over the world to agree to such a difficult bit of report writing unless we could say that this is for everyone to use free, but we wanted to do it to OUP standards. So that was a big part of it. So thank you for recognizing that. I just wanted to comment on the other issues that you'd raised in your comments. The one about going into more depth about the baseline situation is really, it's a great comment. These are things we picked up when editing the reports, is the importance of the baseline pre-pandemic situation and its relevance. So on emergency powers, Israel has been, they just mentioned almost casually in the report that they've been in a state of emergency, I think continuously since either 1948 or 1968, one of those, but either way, this is very relevant. And obviously the role of an emergency declaration in Germany is you need to know the pre-pandemic baseline to make much sense of it. And that's why our current response to gathering that detail is the reliance on rapporteurs representing that important contextual information. And it is in there, it's in most of the reports. In terms of what we do with the analysis of it, that is something that we haven't made a move on yet. I mean, if we'll try to identify some of the important measures about pre-pandemic baselines. I'll talk about trust in a moment, because that's one. The way in which law is transformed into bureaucratic practice, that is a very subtle form of legal sociology that I don't think our reports will have captured in most cases. But hopefully we've fostered relationships that can be used to pursue those kinds of questions. I think most of the people participating have a very, let's say, politically astute form of writing. I think, and by that I mean it's not super legalistic. Rapporteurs had very little difficulty in reporting on the various questions in a way that took account of the political context in a very effective way. On trust, I mean, there's a huge literature on this, and it's related to transparency and democracy and outcomes and legitimacy generally. And we looked at this a little bit on when we were writing about mandatory vaccination, the importance of trust and the approach you have with people who are vaccine hesitant. More generally, what I'd say is that countries that tried to rely exclusively on high levels of trust, we only have one very good example of this, and it's Sweden. And when you compare its performance next to its neighbors, and when the national political system, as far as I know, has accepted that it didn't get it right in the first response to the pandemic, I think the architect of that system is now of that view. So that was part of my point in putting the slide up, comparing Norway and Sweden in the response. In both countries, neither was there a stay-at-home order, but a different legal approach. What I've also noted in the case of the UK, and this isn't social scientific up to your standards, but it is what I've seen, is that the culture here really takes guidance as negotiable in a big way. And essentially, especially the way the pandemic developed, if it was law, it meant that people would do it, even though they knew they could get away with not doing it in many cases. Like having people over at their house, for instance. There were quite high levels of social compliance with the law, even though the enforcement was very weak and lax. As soon as the rules switched from being law to guidance, when they relaxed the lockdown measures, everybody just took it as carte blanche. And within weeks, no one was wearing a mask in public transport, for instance. So I think I come out of this, and perhaps I'm inclined to do that as a lawyer, but thinking that the using legal rules has an important impact on people's perception of whether they should obey, even where the enforcement mechanisms are weak. And so maybe we should be thinking about law the way we sometimes think about guidance. And as for the form of the health system, that is something that some members of the public health team in particular, and Colleen and Brian Thomas are looking at that, Colleen Flood and Brian Thomas. We're reluctant to try to give too strong a view on this because we're not public health scientists. We're trying to see how the public health measures interacted with that. And so we're trying to observe some humility here, even though it's extremely tempting to say this legal measure produced this response. And I think that's true of the project generally. Octavio and I are reluctant to try to generalize about the social impact of particular measures. And that's one of the reasons we brought Andrew into the project, was so that we had someone who properly understands statistics, who would help us avoid where we're tempted to draw inferences about causation, that we tone it back to just pointing out correlations and then back away. So thank you for your intervention. And that's all I have to say at this point.
Octavio, do you want to say something?
No, just to endorse what Jeff has already said, and thank again both you, Luciana, Siri, Marta, for agreeing to be here with us. Jeff and Andrew for the great presentations. I hope it gave you a taste of what the LAC-19 project has to offer. And I re-emphasize, it's just a small taste. We have a bit more after the lunch break on Latin America, but much, much more in the resource, in the website, and in the months to come, because we are really now at the phase where we are starting to process all that wealth of information. And just to add a bit what Jeff said at the end there, and in response to Siri's question, that we really want to collaborate with people from other disciplines in public health and others to try and extract as much of our data as we can without taking the step that Jeff said would be responsible of us to do by ourselves. And that particular question of the health systems and how it relates also to the right to health would be really interesting to do, and hopefully we will be able to do in the future. At the moment, we are focusing on finishing the reports and having the data, all the data there, like ready for people to explore, and then we'll go back to issues that we weren't able to explore in this first phase. So that's it, Luciana. Thank you.
So thank you to everyone who joined us this morning. We don't have time for more questions, but just after lunch, we will have more time to discuss the results from LAC 19 project with the panel Pandemic Responses, a comparative discussions of Latin America at 2 p.m. See you there. Thank you, everybody, to be here with us today.